This is the story of an elderly woman who discovers and cares for an injured baby white monkey. The monkey grows up smart and deeply loves the old woman, but when she passes away, something unexpected happens. Here is the full story. Mama Amara was a poor old woman who had just lost her home, sold by her son, Adebayo. The house that once served as a refuge and gathering place for the family was now just a memory she had to let go of. Adebayo, the son she had raised with love, chose to sell a house for his own business needs. Mama Amara never knew the full extent of the struggles her son was facing, as she was only told one-sidedly that the house needed to be sold for Adebayo to continue his business. The son she had hoped would take care of her in her old age had instead chosen to neglect her, prioritizing his personal gain over the mother who had cared for him all of his life. Adebayo, now living with his wife in a neighboring village, never visited or even inquired about his mother. He refused to take responsibility for her, leaving her to fend for herself in her twilight years. Now Mama Amara was forced to live in a simple hut made of wood and palm leaves, built in the middle of a forest owned by people she did not know. The hut was on the edge of a village, far from the hustle and bustle of life, a place far from the comforts she once enjoyed with her family. Every day, Mama Amara struggled against hunger. She had no money to buy food, and her little hut in the woods offered nothing but cold and loneliness. To survive, she had to walk long distances from village to village, scavenging for leftover food or items she could sell. But every time she passed by the villagers' homes, they would often quickly shut their doors or avoid her. The villagers saw her as a shame, something best left undisturbed. No one wanted to be seen with an old, poor woman who could only rely on the charity of others. Mama Amara felt the weight of her life, but she tried not to show her sadness. For her, the fact that she was no longer valued had become normal. Every day, she faced rejection, humiliation, and loneliness, but she stood tall. She knew no one would come to her aid, and no one would change her life. She had to face it alone. One day, Mama Amara heard news of a big celebration in the village. Some of the neighbors who were better off than her talked enthusiastically about the feast, praising the delicious food and the merrymaking that would take place. Mama Amara, who rarely experienced happiness, felt a glimmer of hope at the thought of seeing people gather and laugh. With a little hope, she decided to go, hoping to experience some joy, even if only for a brief moment. However, when she arrived and entered the courtyard where the celebration was held, the cheerful and lively atmosphere suddenly changed. The host, a man she knew, saw her and immediately approached. In a loud voice, he shouted at Mama Amara to leave, saying her presence would ruin the mood. "Don't come here again, Mama. You don't belong here," the man said with hatred. His words pierced Mama Amara's heart like thorns. It was hard to believe that someone who had once known her could treat her so cruelly. In the midst of the festivities, she felt like an unwanted creature, a burden that was better kept away. Despite this, she tried to remain strong, walking away with heavy steps. But the pain lingered throughout her walk. Along the way, she saw children playing joyfully, oblivious to the world around them. They ran and laughed, so far removed from the life she lived. Mama Amara could only stare at them with empty eyes, feeling more and more isolated and insignificant. Her departure from the celebration symbolized all the rejection she faced every day. Yet for some reason, despite feeling so humiliated, she endured. One gloomy morning, Mama Amara slowly walked to the village market, with faint hope, yet never giving up, to find some food. She carried her old basket, hoping to find leftovers she could eat or sell to survive for one more day. Every step felt heavy, her body growing frailer and weaker, but she kept moving forward. On the way, a group of young men sitting at a coffee shop saw her coming. For no apparent reason, they began mocking her with cruel words. "Oh, Mama smells poor. What are you doing here?" they shouted, laughing. Mama Amara felt ashamed, her body shrinking in front of them, and their words were like knives cutting into her heart. But the young men didn't stop there. They started throwing trash at her, scraps of paper and spoiled food. The garbage hit her, causing her to fall hard to the ground. Her wrinkled hands were scraped by stones and asphalt. Mama Amara felt a pain deeper than the physical wounds she suffered. No one came to help. No one cared about her suffering. Even those passing by glanced at her briefly before continuing on their way, as if nothing had happened. With trembling hands, Mama Amara tried to rise. Every inch of her body ached, but she forced herself to stand. Tears she had held back for so long finally fell, tracing the wrinkles on her weathered face. She wiped them away with her dirty, shaking hands, but her heart continued to weep. She felt abandoned, as though there was no longer a place for her in this world. The pain was deeper than any physical injury. It was a loneliness and humiliation so heavy that it seemed she was no longer human, but something to be mocked and scorned. Mama Amara felt like a shadow, unwanted by anyone, a burden that should be cast aside. The village roads that once felt familiar now seemed like alien paths, full of disgusted glances. She lowered her head, walking slowly away from the market, though she no longer knew where she was headed. No one looked at her with sympathy, and in her solitude, Mama Amara felt that the world had completely forgotten her existence. That night, the air felt colder than usual, and Mama Amara returned to her tiny, almost collapsing hut. The shelter was made of scraps, rotten wooden planks, and dry palm leaves that barely covered the leaking roof. Every gust of wind rattled the fragile walls, adding to the chill that made her body tremble even more. In the darkness, Mama Amara sat alone in a corner of the hut, shivering with cold, her eyes growing heavy, yet sleep would not come. She could not close her eyes without the image of her son, Adebayo, appearing in her mind. That image was so vivid, it danced before her eyes, reminding her of the days when Adebayo was a child, when she cared for him with all the love she had. She remembered feeding him the little food she could gather, holding his hand when he was learning to walk, and the joy his smile brought to the days filled with struggle. But now, all of that seemed like a distant memory. Adebayo, the child she raised with so much love, had sold their house and cast her aside without a second thought. The child she had given everything to now treated her like a stranger, someone who no longer had a place in his life. The suffering and rejection she felt now stung even more as the night deepened. The silence of the night made her feel even more alone and forgotten. She remembered how Adebayo once promised that he would never let her suffer, but now, the reality was far from that. Mama Amara wiped away the tears that flowed from her eyes, feeling the weight of the loss and sadness that gripped her heart. But despite the shattered heart, she remained sitting there, unable to do anything but remember a past she could never reclaim. The next morning, after spending the night in silence and deep pain, Mama Amara stepped out of her small hut. That morning, she hoped to find a little food to fill her empty stomach. Each step felt heavier, but she kept walking, hoping that today her fate would be a little kinder. In the harsh midday sun, she encountered a young woman carrying a shopping basket. The woman looked at Mama Amara with a gaze full of pity, and without a word, she handed over a packet of warm rice. Mama Amara was moved, unable to stop the tears that welled up in her eyes. She wanted to thank the woman, but as she opened her mouth, the woman turned and walked away quickly, as though not wanting to form any connection. Mama Amara could only watch her retreating back, grateful for the small act of kindness, knowing it was fleeting. Sometimes, the pity from a stranger was the only thing she could rely on in this harsh world. But Mama Amara's journey did not end there. As she walked back, passing through the quiet village road, she met an old neighbor, Oluderamola. The man who had once spoken kindly to her now only looked at her with a sneer. Oluderamola stood in front of his house, staring at Mama Amara with a sharp, hateful gaze. "You're still alive, huh?" Oluderamola said with a harsh, mocking tone. "If you want to die, don't do it here. It'll smell." His words were like a dagger to Mama Amara's heart. She stood frozen, unable to reply. Humiliated, she lowered her head, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to shake her frail body. Oludaramola left without a second glance, but his words echoed in her mind, like a taunt she would never forget. Mama Amara felt like she had no place left in this world. Everyone she had once known now saw her as a burden, a useless thing to be discarded. She felt more isolated, more humiliated, and the hope she once had seemed to be slipping further away. But despite the broken heart, she kept walking, continuing down a road she never chose, hoping that someday someone would see her as more than just a forgotten shadow. As the sun blazed down and the air grew dry, Mama Amara walked slowly along the village road, searching for food or perhaps just a place to rest. Her body grew wearier, and her steps became more sluggish. A dizziness overcame her, and before she could take another step, she collapsed in the middle of the road. Passers-by gave her only a passing glance, some furrowing their brows, but no one stopped to help. They glanced at her briefly, then continued on their way, as if she were just part of the landscape, unworthy of attention. Mama Amara lay weak and wounded, her wrinkled face hitting the ground with a thud, but no one cared. When she finally regained consciousness, the weakness that enveloped her body made it hard to move. Her head and body felt like they had been struck by stones, and every movement caused pain. The tears she could not hold back flowed down her face, not from physical pain, but from the heartache. She felt so small, so insignificant. There was no help, no comforting words. She felt as though her life had become a pointless journey, and the despair was eating away at her, day by day. After a while, Mama Amara struggled to get up, her body aching, her heart heavier than before, as if the world had never had a place for her. One morning, Mama Amara made a difficult decision. With a body growing weaker and a mind full of doubt, she walked towards her son Adebayo's house. Her hope was simple. She just wanted to ask for a little food, or perhaps feel some warmth from the son she had raised with so much love. Step by step, she walked down the familiar path she had often taken, the path full of memories of when their family was whole, full of laughter and togetherness. But as she neared Adebayo's house, her heart began to race. She didn't know what to expect, but she was determined to try. She knocked on the door weakly, hoping, though faintly, that her son would hear and open the door with a warm smile, just like before. She waited, as if waiting for a miracle that would never come, but the door remained locked tight, and no sound came from inside. After a while, the sound of footsteps approached from within the house. A young woman opened the door, her face clearly full of displeasure. Without hesitation, she looked at Mama Amara with a disgusted gaze, as if her presence were a blight on the view. "What do you want here?" The woman snapped. "Go away. You have nothing to do with our family anymore." Her words were like a slap in the face to Mama Amara, who had suffered so long. Each word she uttered shattered the little hope Mama Amara had left. Her heart was torn into pieces, as though someone was ripping the deepest part of her soul. She couldn't say a word, couldn't defend herself. There was only silence filling the air around her, and tears welling up in her eyes. All the beautiful memories of Adebayo, the child she had cared for, loved, and fought for, now felt so far away. The child she had once seen as the final refuge in her life now shut the door without a second thought. All that was left was the deep pain and the helplessness she could not express. She turned and walked away with empty steps, unsure of where she was headed. Every step felt heavier, as if the world truly had no place for her anymore. When Mama Amara finally returned to her small, nearly collapsing hut, the rain poured down heavily, as though the sky itself was weeping for her suffering. The rain fell relentlessly, and her frail, aging body grew even weaker in the cold that enveloped her. There was no shelter except under a large tree near her hut. She sat there, soaked to the bone, shivering, but there was no other choice. She could only wrap herself in a worn cloth that could no longer shield her from the rain. Her entire body felt stiff, and the cold rain made her wrinkled skin feel even colder. Despite her trembling, weakened body, She tried to endure, thinking that perhaps this was just another part of a bitter reality she had to accept. But amid the loneliness and unrelenting pain, something unexpected happened. In the midst of the torrential rain, Mama Amara suddenly saw a young child fall in the muddy street. The child cried out in pain, looking lost and frightened. Despite her exhaustion and cold, Mama Amara felt compelled to help. Slowly but surely, she moved toward the child, wanting to offer the love she herself so desperately needed. She gently reached out to the child and helped them to their feet. However, once the child was upright, there were no words of thanks. Instead, the child looked at Mama Amara with a repulsed expression, as if the hand that had helped them was dirty and disgusting. Without a word, the child yanked their hand away and walked off, leaving Mama Amara standing alone in the pouring rain. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her body growing weaker, while tears streamed down her face. Her heart shattered, not from physical pain, but from the deep disappointment. Once again, she felt the world reject her, as if even offering love to a child was not worthy of recognition. So lonely, so painful, she could only pray in the rain, hoping that someday, someone would see her as a human being worthy of respect. But how long would that hope last? A few days after that painful incident, Mama Amara received heartbreaking news. She heard from some people in the village that her son, Adebayo, had bought a luxurious house, a house much bigger and more beautiful than the one they once lived in together. Upon hearing this, Mama Amara's heart shattered. It felt as though every remaining piece of hope within her crumbled at once. She stood still for a moment, trying to digest the news, but the pain was so deep, beyond what words could express. Adebayo, the child she had raised with so much love, the child she had hoped would always be there for her, had now chosen a life of comfort, leaving her in loneliness and suffering. To her, the luxurious house was a symbol of how she had been forgotten, how her son no longer saw her as part of his life. Mama Amara felt like a shadow, an insignificant memory that was meant to be forgotten. Her heart ached, but there was nothing she could do. There was no more path left for her to gain Adebayo's attention. The only thing she could do was cry, letting the tears flow as if they were the only way to release all the sadness and disappointment that had built up inside her. In the midst of her deep solitude, Mama Amara often longed for the days when she was young, full of energy and hope. Back then, she could run fast, work hard to make sure her family had enough, and always give her best. Every smile from Adebayo, every little laugh, was her reason to keep going. She missed those times when life was full of purpose and love. But now, it all felt like a distant memory, like a dream slowly fading away. She would sit in the corner of her hut, staring at the dark sky and reflecting on the life she had lived. Her heart grew heavier with each passing day, but she tried to calm herself, though it was never easy. Every time she remembered the past, when she and Adebayo had a strong bond, she felt empty. The loss felt deeper, and all she could do was hope that someday, in some unknown world, she would find a little happiness again. But that hope now seemed more and more distant, like fog that couldn't be touched, growing further away and more out of reach. One hot day, Mama Amara walked around the village again, searching for anything she could find to fill her stomach, which had been empty for days. She felt her body growing weaker, but she continued to push forward. After searching for a long time, she returned to the one place she thought was her last refuge, her old, worn-down hut. But when she arrived, she was shocked to find that the hut had collapsed, struck by a sudden strong wind. The wooden debris scattered around the ruins of the hut that had once been her home. There was no roof to protect her from the rain or wind. There was no place to rest after the long search for food. Mama Amara could only sit amidst the rubble, confused and stunned. It felt like the world had collapsed around her, and she didn't know where to go. Everything she had, every place she considered safe, had vanished in an instant. There was no other place to return to, no one to rely on. Her heart shattered, and the tears she had held back finally fell, flowing uncontrollably. After hours of sitting amidst the ruins of her life, Mama Amara finally rose, though her body felt weaker and more fragile. She began walking back to the village, hoping someone would care, hoping there would be a door open to her. She knocked on door after door, hoping for some kindness. But each time a door opened, she was met with indifference or even disgust. "What are you looking for here?" asked a housewife with a hateful look. "We have no place for people like you." The same response came from the other houses she knocked on. Everything was closed tight. No one offered a small space, a sliver of hope. Even the neighbors passing by only glanced at her and continued walking without offering any help. Mama Amara felt more and more alienated, more and more insignificant. No one dared help her because they were afraid of being seen with a poor woman like her. Shame seemed more important than humanity. She felt like an unwanted burden, as if her very presence made others uncomfortable. Amidst it all, Mama Amara could only walk with sluggish steps, growing more tired and desperate. She didn't know where to go or how to survive. The world had rejected her, and she felt more and more trapped in a solitude she couldn't escape. In a desperate and weakened state, Mama Amara saw no other choice but to survive, even though her body could hardly bear the burden any longer. Every step felt heavy, and the pain in her body intensified. But in the midst of such deep despair, she felt a small spark of determination that couldn't be extinguished so easily. Without a home, without shelter, she decided to fight again, her resolve growing stronger. Mama Amara began to search for scraps of wood and materials in the village, gathering anything she could use to build a new shelter. With that determination, Mama Amara started piecing together the pieces of wood she found, creating a simple shelter. Every piece of wood, although old and broken, felt significant to her. She carefully arranged them, though her movements grew slower and her body trembled with pain and fatigue. However, there was a fire within her, a fire to survive, to show that even though she was old and poor, she could still stand tall, still fight for a little comfort that she might find. Every time she felt tired, she remembered how she once cared for Adebayo with all her love, how she had always been there for him, even when their lives were full of scarcity. Now she couldn't rely on him anymore, but she could rely on herself. She wanted to close her life with dignity, even though the world had given her so much suffering. She didn't want to die in shame, didn't want to be a burden to anyone, even if it meant fighting alone, without help or support from anyone. With every weakening step, Mama Amara continued to struggle, determined to create a shelter for herself, even if only for a little while longer. One peaceful afternoon, as Mama Amara was walking around the forest, she found something unexpected. Beneath a tree lay a wounded baby white monkey. The small monkey looked weak, trembling from the cold, and its body was clearly covered with injuries. Her heart, full of love, immediately stirred, even though she herself was in no better condition. Without hesitation, she picked up the monkey with trembling hands, feeling how fragile the little creature was. Despite her tired and frail body, Mama Amara did her best to carry the monkey back to her shelter. With great care, she cleaned its wounds and fed it whatever food she had, hoping to save the little life. In the quiet of the shelter, Mama Amara softly spoke to the monkey, giving the love she had long kept to herself. She named the monkey Adebisi, hoping that the name would bring strength and courage to both of them as they faced this increasingly difficult life. As time passed, the bond between Mama Amara and Adebisi grew stronger. The little monkey, although wounded and fragile, grew into a loyal companion who was always by her side. Every day, Adebisi became Mama Amara's source of motivation as she sank deeper into loneliness and despair. With its bright eyes and lively movements, Adebisi chased away the loneliness that had haunted Mama Amara for so long. Together, they shared warmth in the midst of hardship, even as the world around them continued to ignore them. Adebisi would jump around joyfully, making Mama Amara laugh despite her heart being full of pain. Mama Amara came to see Adebisi as the child she never had, a companion who brought new meaning to her life. Every time Mama Amara sat in front of the shelter, Adebisi would sit in her lap, resting its small body against her chest, as if offering a bit of comfort in a world full of suffering. In Adebisi's presence, Mama Amara found a warmth she had long lost. She felt that even though everything else had left her, she still had a small creature who needed her love, and that gave her a reason to keep going. As time went on, Adebisi grew into a large and very intelligent monkey. Mama Amara was amazed at how quickly Adebisi learned. It began following every instruction she gave with ease, even helping with small tasks around the shelter. It would fetch firewood, bring water, and even assist in gathering materials for building shelter. Not only that, Adebisi began mimicking Mama Amara's voice perfectly. The soft tone she used to speak to the monkey was now imitated humorously by Adebisi. Every time Adebisi made a sound like Mama Amara, the old woman would laugh heartily. Its presence, full of energy and cleverness, truly transformed the atmosphere of their lives. From the darkness and silence that had bound Mama Amara, now there was laughter echoing through their humble shelter. Adebisi was no longer just a friend, but a family member who meant so much to Mama Amara. She felt that with Adebisi, her life was beginning to find new meaning. Even though the world continued to bring suffering, Adebisi brought new color to her life that had been full of despair. Mama Amara's life, which had once been lonely and painful, now became filled with happiness, albeit in simplicity. Every day, Mama Amara and Adebisi spent time together, sharing stories and laughter. When Mama Amara felt lonely, Adebisi was always there to keep her company, making funny sounds that brought laughter, sometimes even mimicking the way Mama Amara spoke with incredible accuracy. Sometimes they would sit for hours in front of the shelter, enjoying each other's presence, even though they had little. The life that once felt so empty was now filled with cheerfulness. Mama Amara experienced a happiness she had never felt before, even though everything was so simple. Adebisi, once a wounded baby monkey, had now become a true companion who brought her joy. She no longer felt alone, for every step she took was always accompanied by Adebisi, who never left her side. Adebisi's presence gave her new hope, not just to survive, but to feel the love and laughter that had long been absent from her life. News of Adebisi, the large monkey who could speak, quickly spread throughout the village. At first, people just laughed at the story of a monkey imitating human voices, but over time, the miracle began to stir fear among the villagers. They started watching Adebisi's every move anxiously, trying to find reasons to justify their fears. Could it be that this is not just an ordinary monkey? Someone whispered among them, "Maybe this is a supernatural creature that could bring disaster." Another added with a worried tone. The rumors about Adebisi began to grow, and more people started to believe that the monkey was not an ordinary creature. The villagers began to link Adebisi's ability to mimic Mama Amara's voice with supernatural occurrences, even going so far as to think of Adebisi as an incarnation of an evil spirit that could bring misfortune. Fear began to spread across the village, creating an atmosphere of unease that filled every corner. The peaceful community was now consumed by an irrational fear, all because of something they didn't fully understand. In the midst of the growing fear, Adebisi was seen as a threat that must be avoided. The villagers increasingly isolated Mama Amara and Adebisi, treating them as if they carried a curse. Every time Mama Amara and Adebisi appeared in the market or on the streets, people would watch them warily, even quickly moving away. Some started whispering that Mama Amara had made a pact with evil spirits, or that Adebisi was a demon sent to destroy their village. In truth, Mama Amara was simply trying to survive in the best way she knew how, and Adebisi was just a creature she cared for with love. Yet in the eyes of many, their bond became something unacceptable due to growing misunderstandings and fear. Moreover, some people began reporting strange occurrences that followed Adebisi's arrival in the village, even though these events were merely fantasies and overblown anxieties. The once welcoming villagers had become cold and suspicious. Mama Amara and Adebisi, who had once been symbols of happiness and friendship, were now turned into symbols of fear, to be avoided and even despised. One gloomy morning, Mama Amara, now frail and weak, fell ill. Her aging body could no longer endure, and despite Adebisi's constant presence and his efforts to warm her with everything he had, fate had other plans. Mama Amara passed away peacefully, leaving a world that had caused her much suffering, but also brought her joy through the love she had for Adebisi. The loss was profound for Adebisi. With all his strength, Adebisi began to dig the earth and buried Mama Amara, his grief overwhelming him. From that moment on, he could never stay far from Mama Amara's grave. Every day, Adebisi would sit by the grave, staring at it with eyes full of sorrow, as if hoping his grandmother would return. In silence, he longed for the warmth of her embrace, her gentle touch, and the calming sound of her voice. There was no more laughter or warmth in his life. Adebisi felt empty, and the loneliness he had always known returned, sharper and more painful than before. He could not understand why the world could be so cruel, taking away the person he loved most without giving him a chance to say goodbye. At Mama Amara's grave, Adebisi wept, mourning the deep loss, wishing he could turn back time, hoping to bring back the happiness he had once known. The fear among the villagers continued to grow as they saw Adebisi roaming around the village. Whispers spread through the community, and anxiety gripped them every time Adebisi appeared. Although Adebisi had never shown any aggressive behavior, they began to scrutinize every movement and action of the large ape with suspicion. They feared that he might become a threat, that his presence could bring disaster, as the local myths had suggested. This fear gradually built up, culminating one day when Adebisi was spotted walking around the settlement. Some of the villagers, already influenced by excessive fear, decided to act. They felt it was their duty to protect their village from what they perceived as a real threat, and thus, they began to plan how to remove Adebisi. A group of men from the village, led by those who were particularly suspicious of Adebisi, decided to capture him. They approached him carefully, trying not to scare him. But Adebisi, unaware of what was about to happen, appeared confused. Without mercy, they forcefully tied him with strong ropes and dragged him to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the village. The once friendly and loving Adebisi was now a captive. He struggled with all his might, trying to free himself from the bonds, but his large and powerful body could not overcome the strength of several villagers who had come prepared. Adebisi's cries and screams shattered the village's silence, but no one came to his aid. The other villagers who had once felt sympathy could only watch in silence, some even feeling relieved to see the ape finally subdued. Adebisi, who could not understand why he was being treated this way, could only writhe in confusion, feeling betrayed by the people he had once believed would show him some kindness. For him, the world that had already taught him about loss and loneliness now added yet another wound. Despite offering all the love he had, the world responded with violence and fear. Oluo, a wise man who had known Mama Amara for a long time, began to question the growing belief in the village that Adebisi was a spirit or supernatural being bringing misfortune. Oluo had always been a more rational and wise figure compared to many others in the village who were easily swayed by myths and fear. He realized that the fear of Adebisi likely stemmed from ignorance and overblown anxiety. Understanding that Adebisi was not a threat, Oluo decided to approach the large ape directly. He slowly walked towards the abandoned building where Adebisi was held, his eyes full of empathy as he looked at the confused and wounded Adebisi, both physically and emotionally. In a gentle voice, Oluo began to speak to Adebisi, asking with genuine concern, "Are you looking for Mama Amara?" Oluo asked carefully, knowing that behind Adebisi's closeness to Mama Amara, there must be a touching story. Adebisi, who had previously remained silent, now gazed at Oluo with eyes full of sorrow and longing. He nodded slowly and, in a voice barely audible, replied, "Mama Amara is gone. I miss her so much." Hearing Adebisi's response, Oluo's heart grew heavy. The depth of grief in Adebisi's words was undeniable, despite him being just an ape. Oluo, who had known Mama Amara for many years, understood how much love Mama Amara had given to Adebisi, and how Adebisi had become one of the most precious parts of Mama Amara's life. Even though Mama Amara lived in simplicity and hardship, she was always full of love, not only for fellow humans, but also for any creature in need. Oluo was deeply moved by Adebisi's confession and stood still for a moment, reflecting. He could not allow fear and ignorance to dominate his village any longer. Oluo knew that although Adebisi was an unusual large ape, he was not a threat, but a loyal companion who had lost the person he loved most. With a heavy heart, Oluo decided to speak with the villagers and open their eyes to the truth that Adebisi was a symbol of true affection, not a malevolent creature to be cast aside. However, this change would not be easy, as hatred and fear had already taken root deeply in the hearts of many in the village. Hearing the profound sadness in Adebisi's voice, Oluo felt a powerful and undeniable emotion. His heart was moved as he realized the immense love and loss that Adebisi had experienced. In an instant, Oluo understood that everything the villagers had done up to this point was based on unfounded fear. Adebisi was not a threat, but a being filled with sincerity, simply seeking the love and warmth he once received from Mama Amara. Oluo looked at the gathered villagers with understanding in his eyes, then gestured for them to release the ropes that bound Adebisi's large body. The tense atmosphere slowly began to ease. Although some villagers still harbored worry, their hearts were gradually touched by an unexpected empathy. One by one, the villagers who had been fearful and suspicious began to untie the ropes. They realized that their fear had only been an illusion, born from ignorance and misguided prejudice towards something they did not understand. The process of untying the ropes felt slow, yet deeply significant. Once the ropes were removed, Adebisi stood up slowly, his large body appearing more frail after being confined for so long. Yet there was no longer any hatred or fear in Adebisi's face. Only confusion remained. The villagers who had once viewed him with fear began to feel a deep sympathy. They realized that Adebisi was not the monster they had imagined, but a creature suffering from the loss of someone he loved, something they could hardly fathom. Some villagers cautiously approached, offering bits of food to Adebisi, while others offered sincere smiles as an apology. Gradually, the tension in the village began to melt away, replaced by more humane feelings. Though not everyone could accept Adebisi immediately, there was a glimmer of hope that with time, understanding and compassion would replace fear and hatred. Adebisi, who had once felt isolated, now began to experience a sense of freedom. Though Mama Amara was no longer by his side, he felt a little calmer knowing there was a flicker of kindness in a world that had once hurt him. However, even as freedom came, he could not forget the loss that still scared his heart. Oluo, witnessing the shift in the villagers' attitudes, felt that the next step was to allow Adebisi the chance to find peace in the place that meant the most to him, Mama Amara's grave. Wisely, Oluo suggested that Adebisi be taken back to the place where they had shared so many happy and peaceful memories together. Adebisi should return to the place he loves, the place where he feels connected to Mama Amara. There, we can give him the opportunity to mourn in the way he should, Oluo said gently, understanding the deep influence Mama Amara had on Adebisi. The villagers, now beginning to understand the true loyalty and affection Adebisi held, agreed with Oluo's suggestion. Slowly, they began to walk with Adebisi towards Mama Amara's grave. Some brought flowers as a mark of respect, while others walked in silence, trying to understand the profound bond between Adebisi and Mama Amara. The once tense and fearful atmosphere was now replaced with empathy and respect, an extraordinary change that slowly unfolded in a village that had previously been so harsh towards Adebisi. Upon reaching Mama Amara's grave, Adebisi appeared remarkably calm, though sadness still lingered in his eyes. With a heart full of love, he sat beside the grave, gazing at the tombstone bearing Mama Amara's name. His large hands gently touched the earth surrounding the grave, as if trying to feel the presence of Mama Amara once more. No words were spoken, but Adebisi's body language spoke volumes. He felt an immense connection to the ground that Mama Amara had once walked. His longing was pure and overwhelming, as though the earth itself still held traces of the love Mama Amara had given him. The villagers who were present watched with emotion, some even shedding tears, deeply moved by the unspoken bond between Adebisi and Mama Amara. They now understood that Adebisi was not a threat or a supernatural being, but a creature in mourning, simply seeking peace in a place filled with beautiful memories of the one he loved. In that silence, the village began to realize the importance of mutual understanding and respect, to look deeper into the essence of every living being, because sometimes true love comes in forms we never expect. Although Adebisi was now accepted by the villagers, he felt increasingly estranged from human life. The villagers' decision to let him return to Mama Amara's grave and treat him more kindly offered some comfort, yet in his heart, he knew his place was not among humans. Every time he saw their faces, once filled with fear and now softening, there was an unspoken feeling he could not hide. The feeling that he was only accepted out of pity, not because he was truly considered a part of the community. Among them, Adebisi still felt like an outsider, a creature allowed to stay only because of Mama Amara, not because of himself. Even though the villagers no longer feared him, Adebisi felt an emptiness that could not be filled by mere acceptance. His longing for Mama Amara grew stronger every day, and each time he heard human laughter, he felt it was not a world he was meant to inhabit. He wanted to feel the love he once had, but the world no longer offered him a place to do so. Finally, with a heavy heart, Adebisi decided to return to the forest that had once been his home. That place, though filled with memories of solitude, remained the only place he could truly consider home. There, among the tall palm trees and the calm air, Adebisi felt a little freer, a little more himself. Leaving the village with a look full of love and complicated emotions, Adebisi walked away, feeling that, although he had been accepted by humans, he would never fully belong to their world. In the human world, he always felt like an observer, an outsider looking in, never truly part of it. The forest, once full of loneliness, had now become a place for him to seek peace, even though his heart could never fully heal from the loss of Mama Amara. There, Adebisi hoped to find tranquility, even knowing that the memories of Mama Amara would continue to haunt every step he took, every breath he drew, because without Mama Amara, he was a lost creature in a world too vast and too incomprehensible. On the other side, days passed slowly, and Adebayo became more isolated in his grim life. The business he had once built with great hope and ambition, aiming to give a better life to himself and his family, now crumbled piece by piece. Everything he had planned seemed to slip through his fingers, falling apart without any way to fix it. He had once been so confident, hoping to change his family's fate, but now he could only watch as the destruction he had caused unfolded before him. No more customers came, no job offers or support from his friends. They all distanced themselves, aware that Adebayo was now just a shadow of the successful person they once knew. Old friends who used to visit him now avoided him, not just because of his failure, but because they knew he had become a burden, someone too mired in his financial and emotional struggles. Adebayo, who once had everything, now felt a deep emptiness and loneliness. He couldn't even provide for his family, and in the end, his wife and children left him, leaving Adebayo alone. One quiet night, as Adebayo sat alone in the empty living room, a deep sense of regret hit him. A house, which had once been filled with life and laughter, now felt so empty and bleak. Every corner of the room seemed to remind him of the memories he had lost, especially the memories of his mother, Mama Amara. He remembered the times when his mother was always there for him, caring for him with a love so genuine despite their lack of material wealth. Adebayo lowered his head, feeling the heavy burden in his chest, regretting having pushed away the mother who had loved him so much for the sake of his own ambition. How ashamed he had once felt, and how uncaring he had been towards his mother's suffering, seeing her as a burden to be discarded. Now, after everything he had lost, Adebayo felt a deep, belated regret. He began to understand how cruel the world could be, how cruel the life his mother had endured, cruel in its loneliness, rejection, and neglect. Adebayo felt as though he was now experiencing the suffering his mother had once endured, as if every mistake and neglect he had made was now haunting him. The world that once felt so beautiful now seemed oppressive, like a punishment he could not escape. And though he wished he could fix everything, he knew it was too late. His mother was gone, and there was no chance to repay the love he had once ignored. One day, Adebayo received even more devastating news. The house he had always been so proud of, the symbol of his status, had been seized by the bank. Unpaid loans, failed investments, and inevitable bankruptcy had now forced him to lose the only home he had. The house, once full of dreams and hopes, was now just an asset the bank deemed necessary to repossess. With a broken heart, Adebayo watched as the bank agents arrived and began to take over the house, changing the locks and emptying all its contents. Everything he had fought for, which he once believed proved his success, was now nothing more than a bitter memory thrown away. Adebayo sat in the empty yard, reflecting on it all, feeling the bitterness of the reality he had created. Everything he had, now lost, and he felt so alone, without hope. The karma of his actions toward Mama Amara, whom he had once cast aside, had now come back in a way far harsher than he had imagined. No more house, no family, no place to hide. All he could do was reflect on his mistakes and realize that this world would never show mercy to those who had never shown mercy.